So this morning, instead of the sermon, we will be hearing from Heather Kramer, who will give more details about a journey that a group of folks from our parish have been on for about 2 years to discover more about who we are, our history as a parish, as we begin, or as we continue really, to discern where we are going. So, Heather, thank you very much for your leadership on this, and look forward to her report.
Good morning, everyone. O peace of God, settle over me and within me, so that I cannot tell mine from thine, and thine from mine. Amen. So in 2020, the ECCT required that churches in Connecticut take steps to discover and document their historic complicity with racism in their parish and communities. And a word about complicity. Complicity can be organized and deliberate, or it can be passive and casual, and we believe specifically as a community of faith that we need to acknowledge all harms caused by both types of complicity. So the Trinity Community for Racial Justice began work in the spring of 2020 in the midst of COVID on our response to this requirement. This report is not meant to be a new history of Trinity Church, but instead it's a widening and an opening of our understanding of our history in relation to complicity with racism and white supremacy present in Hartford and the church during its 164 years. The language quoted in the primary source materials of the time to describe Black people was not updated, specifically in the Hartford Current articles, serving as a reminder of the language of white supremacy of that time. Although our report focuses on the parish and the period of our church, we remember the indigenous peoples who lived on the land preceding our founding and were displaced and decimated by early white settlement in Connecticut. They included, but were not limited to, the people known as the Pequots, the Podunk, and the Tunxis in the areas closest to the Connecticut River in what is now Hartford. We focused our research on 3 eras, beginning with our founding in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War, and our findings confirm that the history of our parish aligned with the larger history of complicity with racism and white supremacy in the 19th century in Connecticut. None of this was surprising, but it challenged notions that Hartford and New England were places without an enduring legacy of enslavement. Hartford was a place of deeply rooted and persistent racism, whose economy was fully integrated with the economy of enslavement, despite our history of prominent local abolitionists and anti-slavery movements. However, we also discovered important contradictions in Trinity's history, founded by a group of extremely wealthy and influential white men of Hartford. We learned that during the late 19th century, despite the racism and inequality that was daily life for Black people in Hartford, Connecticut, Trinity Church was a place where in the 19th century some Black Episcopalians worshiped and were included as members of our church community, at least for a time. This provides us with a little bit of an understanding of how we come to be the church that we are today. So our first era is the founding of Trinity and the Hartford wealth and complicity with enslavement before and after the Civil War. A recent report by the Equal Justice Initiative called the Transatlantic Slave Trade helped us understand the extent to which the economies of the slave trade influenced and built the economies of large cities such as Hartford. Wealthy Connecticut merchants manufactured and sold their goods to the Caribbean and southern plantation owners as part of the global trade that sustained the enslavement of people and generated enormous profits for its participants. The report notes even after some called for the abolition of the slave trade and steps were taken towards gradual emancipation, white New Englanders remained committed to the system of slavery that sustained their local economies. Enslavement remained legal in Connecticut until the decade just prior to our church's founding. Several of our founders were directors or presidents of Hartford insurance companies, and the wealth to start the church came in large part from the insurance industry. However, we could find no direct ties between the insurance of enslaved persons. Published research ties that practice specifically to the company that later became Aetna and New York Life, as well as insurance companies in the Carolinas. Nevertheless, the wealthy of Hartford reaped the profits of slavery's corollary commercial transactions in banking, shipping, and insurance, as historian Kathleen Harris writes. Indeed, prior to the abolition of slavery in Connecticut, all the principal families of Norwich, Hartford, and New Haven owned one or two enslaved Africans. Our church's founders' wealth and influence came from an economy and society built on the back of enslaved persons and was inseparable from that pervasive economic and human exploitation. Senator James Dixon, one of the most prominent of our founders, was an important national figure whose former home is located on the premises of what is now the Aetna headquarters. He was also a leader in the Hartford insurance industry and a confidant to Abraham Lincoln. He was elected as a Republican to the U.S. Senate in 1856, making him a U.S. Senator when Trinity was founded. He was a strong opponent to the expansion of slavery. In addition to being anti-slavery, however, Dixon was in favor of colonization of freed black men and women and made speeches that were pro-colonization. This colonization movement was viewed by some whites as a practical and humane solution for freed persons, but it indicates unwillingness of white Northerners to grant freed men and women of color equal rights in their own society. There was no similar plan to recolonize freed white indentured servants, for example. In African American Connecticut Explored, Kathleen Harris writes, African Americans viewed colonization as a means of defrauding them of the rights of citizenship and a way of tightening the grip of slavery. Meanwhile, Northern pro-colonizationists supported colonization because they feared the activism of free African Americans and their insistence on full citizenship rights. An example of the extent to which the web of the slave economy was tied to the wealth of Hartford families and our founders is illustrated by the case of Reverend Francis Goodwin. He was an early rector of Trinity from 1865 to 1871, and the Goodwins were among the most wealthy and influential citizens of Hartford, if not New England. Their money gave substantial funds to the founding of Grace Church in the Parkville section, and also many city parks. And also our Goodwin Hall was founded in memory of a family member by their money. Their fortune came in part from direct ties to the Morgan family of Hartford, that is J.P. Morgan's family, through Reverend Francis Goodwin's mother, Lucy Morgan. Morgan Bank owned branches in Louisiana in the mid-19th century that secured loans with plantation land and enslaved persons as collateral. Reverend Goodwin's wife, Mary Alsop Jackson, came from families in South Carolina that owned rice plantations. However, as we will learn, Reverend Goodwin's views on which people were part of the family of Trinity is an example of the complexity of racism in our church's history. Our second era is Reconstruction to the First World War and the segregation that was present in Hartford. Post-Civil War Hartford was a prosperous but highly segregated city. Black churches created the social centers of the city for their congregations. For example, although the Hartford public schools admitted black students, parents felt their children were safer and less likely to be harassed at one of the city's African American church schools. Christopher Collier writes of this struggle, segregated public schools nevertheless continued to function in Connecticut for 8 years after they had been declared illegal in 1864 by the General Assembly. Amid this climate of Jim Crow segregation found in houses of worship, housing, and education in Hartford, we found an important exception within Trinity Church Parish. One of our rectors during this period was particularly responsible for spreading the idea in the city of Hartford that there should be no segregation in worship. Reverend Ernest Ephraim Miel, rector from 1895 to 1925, was schooled in the social gospel from his training in New York City, and he had a profound impact on the worshiping community of Trinity Church and also Hartford at large. Our articles from the archives of the Hartford Courant provide important perspective on the work of Miel to promote racial understanding during the time of Jim Crow. On July 11, 1904, the Hartford Courant relates an occasion where Reverend Miel played an important role and provides details about Episcopal people of color in the city's churches. At the convention, Reverend Ernest DeFremery Miel of the city recommended the extension of the work of the church among colored people. There are about 50 colored people who are members of different Episcopal churches in this city, including St. John's, St. Thomas's, Christ Church, and Trinity Church. In 1905, St. Monica's Church is founded in Hartford. We learn that Reverend Miel was against segregated worship, calling it unchristian segregation. It is in this historic context that we learn more about two specific people of color who were members of Trinity Hartford at this time. The two of these individuals were honored in a photographic memorial found normally in our kitchen hallway of Trinity missioners. We refer to the legends of the final two photos. Reverend Robert Josiah Johnson, baptized in 1886 and confirmed in Trinity Church, became a priest in 1920 and served on a mission to Durham, North Carolina. A search in our parish archives of baptisms from 1886 performed by Reverend Seymour lists Robert and his sisters and mother as baptized on May 23, 1886, along with many other children and adults. His parents were Robert and Madeline Johnson, and Robert Johnson presented his wife and 5 children that day for baptism at Trinity: Libertha, Louisa, Daisy, Eleonora, and Robert. As the memorial notes, Robert Josiah, the youngest of that group, goes on to become an Episcopal priest ordained in 1910. Our church register notes that their baptism was sponsored by the Reverend Francis Goodwin. Miss Frances Marion Shaw was baptized in 1889 in Trinity Church, attended Hartford Public Schools, and went on to mission service for Trinity. We located Frances Marion Shaw in our parish archives as well. We found her in a large group of confirmands recorded in the book by Reverend Miel on April 3, 1904. Her mission service to Tryon, North Carolina as an adult would have been a challenging undertaking for a woman of color. Further research into these individuals and other families could yield more information about the extent to which Trinity welcomed non-white parishioners during this time of Jim Crow segregation in Hartford. There is no recording of race in our parish registers at that time or at any time. It is important to note that these people remain part of the parish after their baptisms and confirmations. After World War I and continuing through the Depression and World War II, we read occasional racist language in the Trinity Parish records, such as disparaging remarks about Mexico and Mexicans. We also see the economic and social pressures and classism of the time reflected in the letters of the rector and the warden of Trinity Church. In the 1932 rector's report from Cunningham, we read, "We are doing our duty as a neighborhood church. Strangely enough, there are those who feel the results are too democratic for safety. We need to realize that the church must serve all classes of people." Our last era is World War II through the Civil Rights era. By the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Civil Rights era, Black Americans made about 6.5% of the total population of Hartford. The cities of Hartford's non-white population grew steadily in the pre- and post-war period as farming, manufacturing, and insurance companies attracted workers to the state. New waves of immigration from the Caribbean in the late 1940s through the 60s, as well as farm labor from the American South, also added to the growth of Hartford's BIPOC population. Well-paying jobs were difficult to obtain for Black residents who served in World War II and returned home, including within the area's most prominent businesses. This lack of opportunity, as well as equal education and housing, became important causes for the NAACP, the Black Panthers, and other civil rights groups local to Hartford. As late as 1959, 5 years after Brown versus Board of Education, 37% of whites in Connecticut opposed integrated residential neighborhoods. Trinity has an extensive collection of photos of the parish and members during this period, including church worship, fellowship, and Sunday school attendees. We do not see any people of color in these photos taken at Trinity during the pre- and post-World War II period, until photos from the early 1960s and 70s start to show a parish that includes many people of color. To illustrate the lingering pervasiveness of racism in this period, we can reflect on the story of one person who's memorialized in a large oil portrait hung prominently in Goodwin Hall, Jesse Mallory. Jesse was our sexton for many years and is fondly remembered by parishioners. Nancy Crandall grew up at Trinity, and her parents were close friends of Jesse and his wife. Jesse and his wife were beloved by many church members, she recounted, but some people were shocked when Trinity hired a black sexton. She also remembers that not all church members were pleased that Jesse and his wife were an interracial couple. Mr. Mallory served Trinity for many years, and he became an integral part of the Trinity family. Despite the lingering racism of some individuals, Nancy also recalled that by the late 60s, there were numerous black professionals and their families who were warmly welcomed to worship at Trinity. During this period, Trinity Church welcomed increasing numbers of BIPOC worshipers and engaged in community civil rights causes. During the 1960s, the Hartford Community Renewal Team is founded with 6 of its members coming from Trinity Church. Nonetheless, during the last half of the 20th and early part of the 21st century, despite our growing diversity, Trinity's lay and clergy leadership remained largely white and male. The first woman, Betsy Stephen, was elected to the vestry in 1965. And the first non-white assistant rector, Horace Johnson, was called several decades later. We were asked at the beginning of this project by one of the members of our community for racial justice the important question of, so then what? In other words, after we do this history, what next? Telling our story is the first step. Acknowledging and talking about our history of white privilege and racial injustice, along with all its contradictions, is the next step. And we will start that conversation during the adult forum today. We should honor the pioneering people of color from our congregation who have been identified in this study and do further research on their personal histories. Importantly, the work for racial justice continues at Trinity Church today. We have been invigorated by the leadership of Reverend D. Littlepage to faithfully continue the work begun by the groups that started that work here in the 1960s. With the approval of the vestry, Trinity recently decided to become a member of the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance, or GIA. It is by action that we can cement the work of justice based on the gospel and our love of this community into our future path. In 2023, you'll hear lots more about opportunities to join us as we partner with GIA. In closing, this work was made possible by Liz Kirkpatrick, our archivist retired, who introduced us to the treasure trove of documents in our church's own archives. By research performed by Anne Green on the genealogy of the Goodwin family, Enid Oberholzer, who researched Trinity and the founding of St. Monica's, and by Linda McGugan, who did a deep dive into the archives of the Hartford Current and Reverend Dr. Miel, and who first noticed the photos of the Trinity missioners. Nancy Crandall provided memories of Trinity Parish from the 50s to the 80s, and invaluable guidance and perspective was provided by Walton Foster. In the words of Stephen Charleston, Choctaw elder and Episcopal bishop, when we claim hope for our home, when we make it the guiding energy of our faith, we transition from being scattered individuals who wish things would get better into being active partners with the Spirit, reshaping the balance of life towards mercy, justice, and peace. Hope becomes our goal. Thank you.